Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today, I'm delighted to welcome back Dr. Louay Fatoohi, an author and researcher in Islamic studies and comparative religion. You're most welcome, sir.
You're welcome, Paul. Thank you very much for inviting me back to this fantastic channel. Thank you.
Well, it's good to see you again. And for those who don't know, just to remind you, Dr. Fatoohi was born in Baghdad in Iraq and migrated to the UK in the 1990s. He has a PhD in astronomy from Durham University, one of Britain's leading universities. He came originally from a Christian family, but reverted to Islam in his early 20s. He has published over 25 books in English and Arabic in Islamic studies and published over 25 research papers in cosmology and applied historical astronomy and on the Islamic calendar. Today, Dr. Fatoohi has kindly agreed to give a clear and easy to understand overview of the controversial subject of abrogation in Islam. He will discuss its history, what different scholars have said about it, problems it tries to solve, problems it might introduce, including those that are picked up in anti-Islam polemics. The goal is to help us as viewers, even if we have not heard of abrogation, have a clear and concise but complete understanding of all the issues involved. So this is quite an information-rich program, a lot of content for our benefit. So I hand over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Paul. Now, before I start, as you, Paul, said, abrogation is a very controversial subject. It's little known to many Muslims. They might have heard of it, but probably they don't know fully the implications of this doctrine. Yet at the same time, it has a long history that extends probably from the 2nd century or so of Islam and developed over a long period of time. It has a huge significance for a variety of subjects that are very critical to Islam. And what I'm going to do, I will be reviewing, I'm going to introduce the subject of abrogation. I'm going to try to make it as easy as possible, avoiding any too technical details, let's say. But Paul, please do help me by interjecting every now and then, and stop me, please, if I say something that's not very clear. And I really appreciate your help with that.
Well, it's very, very, very generous of you to offer that. So thank you for that.
I will also, in the course of this discussion, be presenting the views of various scholars, as well as my own take on things. I hope to provide enough information for the viewers, to any viewer really, to first of all, to have a clear, kind of complete understanding of what abrogation is about, and also to put them on a pathway where they can follow further information, seek further information if they want to look into more detail into what I'm going to say. I'll try my best to kind of mention any references where I've taken anything, hadith in particular, of course. When there's an ayah, I always, a verse, I always mention the number and the chapter. So again, it should be easier for viewers to check for themselves and take it any further. Okay. Now, to make things easier, I am going to share here my presentation.
Here we go. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, here we go. Right. So what are the critical issues that that the subject of abrogation touches on? First of all, it deals with the final divine laws. So as we know, the Qur'an was revealed over 22 years. This is a long period of time during which changes did happen, circumstances changed, circumstances of the Muslim community. Obviously, they moved from Mecca to Medina at some point, and 22 years is a long period of time. So one objective of abrogation is to try and study the final laws, the laws that survive and we call Sharia, which are obviously very important for every Muslim. The second subject that again is kind of important, of course, is the relationship between the Qur'an and the Sunnah. That's also, for obvious reasons, is a very important subject. Now, the Qur'an at times appear to have some contradictions in terms of one law or one statement that seems to say something about or convey a particular ruling, and another that seems to be slightly different. Now, I'm calling it contradictions is a bit of a kind of big term, but that's how it's seen by some, which is why they then use the concept of abrogation to try and reconcile such statements. And then the subject of the preservation of the Quranic revelation. Now, I have to admit, when I started studying abrogation, my interest was really more in this last particular topic. I'm not a jurist. Sharia is important, but I'm not a jurist myself. But my interest was, and I work always with the tafsir and history and the Quran. So my interest was more in history and the history of the Quranic text, which actually what led me to study this subject in considerable details. And the questions really we have here, more specifically about the preservation of the Quran, is, do we have all of the Quranic verses that were revealed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? That's really the big question. So I will be introducing abrogation in general, dealing with the other issues, but I will be focusing much of this interview on this latter subject, the preservation of the Quranic text.
Okay.
Now, first of all, let me define what abrogation is. Abrogation, there's a standard definition, the easy definition, if you like. This is how this complex subject starts. It starts with a simple definition that kind of promises simplicity and clarity. But once you've gone a bit further, slightly further in the study of the subject, it turns into something completely different, far more complex, complicated. The standard definition is that abrogation is the annulment of one legal ruling by another. So it's no different in Islamic law and Islamic studies from its definition in any other legal context. The abrogation, abolishment, if you like, of a particular law, but replacing it with another. That is the standard definition. Abrogation as a doctrine is accepted by most scholars. And I mean by that, scholars from different schools. Shi'is, Sunnis, also there are different flavors, if you like, Wahhabis, Sufis, Salafis, etc. All of them, generally, by and large. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody accepted it, but most accepted abrogation. In the recent years, in the last few decades, there have been more scholars coming out criticizing abrogation and kind of finding issues with it more than happened over many centuries in the past. I will be covering some of this, but we will see what issues they are coming up against. There are two sources of legislation in Islam, the Quran and the Sunnah, of course.
Yeah.
When you look at, some people include consensus, ijma'.
Yes.
Now, ijma' actually isn't, strictly speaking, a third source of legislation in usul, because it's ultimately has to rely on the Sunnah and the Quran. So no group of Muslims, regardless of how many they are, can come together, agree on something, and consider it as part of Islam if it's not supported by the Qur'an or the Sunnah. So these are the two sources. And there are four different types of abrogation. We can have the Qur'an abrogating the Qur'an, or the Sunnah abrogating the Sunnah, the Qur'an abrogating Sunnah, and Sunnah abrogating Qur'an.
Wow.
That's most scholars accept that, but not all of them. Not all of them. Shafi'i, for instance, separated the two. He accepted abrogation, so the abrogation as a principle, and accepted the abrogation of the Qur'an by the Qur'an and the Sunnah by the Sunnah, but not between the two. In this regard, he's very much in the minority. There's also one narrative attributed to Ibn Hanbal that also agrees with this particular opinion. The most cases of abrogation are actually cases of Quranic abrogation, not Sunnah. So there are some cases of Sunnah abrogation, but the overwhelming majority are Quranic studies. So if you pick up any book on naskh, as it's known in Arabic, or abrogation, that's what you find it focused on mainly, as well as some cases, of course, where it deals with the Sunnah. Now, there's one interesting fact here that I should mention. Despite the fact that there are hundreds of claims of abrogation cases, and when I say hundreds of claims, as in hundreds of verses that have been claimed to have been abrogated, there is not a single verse, nor a single hadith that says ruling so-and-so or this particular verse was abrogated by this verse. There is no such statement anywhere in the Qur'an or in the Sunnah. All cases of abrogations are concluded indirectly.
Right.
So there is no such a statement.
So I found that a very helpful observation you just made. So there's no explicit statement of abrogation. A abrogates B or nullifies B, although it is apparent to scholars that is what is happening, but it's not explicitly stated. And I think that's very interesting. Thank you for that.
Obviously, that's what we find scholars, the claims of scholars all the time.
Yes.
The Qur'an itself has no such statement. The Sunnah itself has no such statement. And that should be considered a significance for this very simple reason. If abrogation is as critical as kind of all-encompassing as we're going to see, then surely you would have expected this to be mentioned at least once, twice, but not, it isn't. So even though abrogation of the Sunnah isn't, strictly speaking, the subject here, but I would like to cover it for the benefit of viewers. So the Sunnah can be abrogated in two ways, as we mentioned, by the Qur'an or by the Sunnah. So what's an example of abrogation by the Qur'an? Changing the qibla is usually taken as an example of abrogation of the Sunnah because, as we know, the verse talks about changing the qibla. So the question is, but how did the Muslims know up to that point where they should be facing when they pray? So the implication is that the Prophet ﷺ must have told them that.
Yeah. Now, they were praying, weren't they, towards Jerusalem, I think, originally in their prayers. So Muslims weren't facing Mecca, they were facing Jerusalem. Then the Qur'an in a revelation came along and told the Muslims to pray in a different direction towards Mecca, obviously.
Thank you, Paul. Absolutely spot on. So the question is, if the change is mentioned, but the first qibla isn't mentioned in the Quran, then where did it come from? It must have been the Prophet ﷺ who told them about it. So this is taken as an example of changing an abrogation of the Sunnah by the Quran. Okay, fasting Ramadan. when the Prophet ﷺ went to Medina, he was told that the Jews there used to fast a day called Ashura, which was related to their history about Prophet Musa, Moses. But when he was told that, history tells us that he said to the Muslims, well, we should then also be fasting Ashura because I'm as close to Moses as any. There are two stories. One of them suggests that he made that obligatory, and others suggest that he made it optional. And the further history tells us that later on, when Ramadan was revealed, the fasting of Ramadan revealed in the Qur'an, the Muslims stopped fasting Ashura. It became also, some stories suggest it became optional after it was obligatory, because there are two different versions. But that's another example of the Sunnah being abrogated by the Qur'an. An example of the abrogation of Sunnah by the Sunnah. Now, we have a story when the Prophet ﷺ was not feeling well, and he prayed while sitting. So he was the Imam, and he was sitting, and Muslims were praying behind him, and they sat because he was sitting.
Gosh.
So that was the first ruling from Sunnah, that if the Imam sat while praying because he couldn't stand, then you do the same. Later on, towards the end of his life, when he was ill in his more or less last illness, when he went to pray, he sat, but he asked Abu Bakr to lead the prayer on his behalf effectively. And then because he was sitting, he asked Abu Bakr actually to stand as usual and pray. And that is considered as an example where Sunnah was abrogated by Sunnah. Because even though the Prophet ﷺ sat, the Abu Bakr and the rest of the Muslims actually stood when praying, like we do today.
Very interesting.
Quickly, another example. There's a story about the sacrifices of the Hajj. The Prophet at some point said that you cannot store the meat of the sacrifices for more than 3 days. But later on, he allowed Muslims to store it for longer. There are reasons why people think he did that. At times they say because there was some kind of starvation in that area, and there were people coming for the Hajj, and he wanted some of the meat to be left there for those who are going to arrive who are in need of food. But regardless of why he stated that, the history tells us that later he changed that ruling. So that's another example. There are others like visiting tombs. Again, it was banned, then he allowed it. Making juice in certain containers, that's apple, for instance, juice or date juice. Apparently, they say because these containers were used to be used for making wine, alcoholic, etc. drinks in the past. He didn't want that to kind of happen inadvertently, so he's prevented Muslims from using them. But later on, when this is no more, there's no more risk of that, he allowed them to use those containers.
Would another example be the writing down of the Qur'an itself? In the early days, did the Prophet prohibit the physical writing down of the ayat, but then for various reasons, but later on permitted it for another set of reasons?
That's absolutely true. I think it all hinges on the earlier story, whether there was, that was indeed not the case, as in not don't write down. But yes, absolutely spot on. Any case whereby a ruling was later abrogated, changed by another, is considered as a standard case of abrogation. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Now, abrogation of the Qur'an, this is where most cases of abrogation are. Even though I don't cover this in detail, we're talking hundreds of verses. Ibn Jawzi considered 247 claims of abrogation. Now, the seriousness of this shows more when you look at a subject like the sword verse, the so-called verse of the sword. According to some well-known jurists like Ibn al-Arabi, that's not to be confused with Ibn Arabi, the Sufi sheikh, Ibn al-Arabi, who said that this particular verse abrogated every verse that tolerated the polytheists, allowed for having peace with them, etc. Just about basically blanket abrogation. One scholar, 20th century scholar, counted over 140 verses of the Qur'an that deal with peace and basically allowing the polytheists and others to cohabit with Muslims that are said to have been abrogated by this particular verse, which is verse number 5 of chapter Tawbah. But that's just a side example I wanted to mention here, because just to show the number of cases and how serious it can get at times when you have this kind of uncontrolled really claim. Again, here we have two cases, abrogation by the Qur'an and by the Sunnah. The most obvious case that just about everybody who believes in the abrogation refers to is the case when the Muslims were ordered to pay charity before they have an audience with the Prophet ﷺ, which was later rescinded. Or that's how the verse is understood. That is how it's understood. Wow. Now, in my personal view, there is actually no abrogation even in there. The idea here, or the concept that all accept, is that if two rulings can be reconciled, then you don't have a case of abrogation. Yeah. And in my view, this particular verse, we can't get into it, it's too technical, is not necessarily a case of abrogation. Now, what I should say about this verse is that this is the one verse that everybody who believes in abrogation believes to be a case of abrogation. The one verse. And the wisest...
Which verse is that? Do you know? Have you got the reference, please?
Yeah, it's Al-Mujadala number 13, Surah Al-Mujadala. I have it here in Arabic. Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu idha najaytum ar-rasul. Or you who believe, if you wanted to have an audience with the Prophet, then present before that a charity, some kind of donation, if you like. And then it tells them that this is better for you, etc. But the verse goes on to say, and if you don't, and if you can't do that, something along these lines, and Allah has forgiven you, then X, Y, Z, as if you continue, you don't need then to do that. That's how it's understood. I don't actually see necessarily this is a case of abrogation, but that is the verse that is accepted by everybody who accepts abrogation. But this is the only one. Why is it the only one, even though we have lots of cases of abrogation? Because even when you have, because some scholars accepted as few as 5 cases. Suyuti accepted only 22. Depends on how you read his text. Yeah. So accepted only, say, 20, whereas there are others who accepted over 200. And the one verse that appears as among the accepted cases for all of these is this one verse. There's also another example. I'm just giving examples here. There is a verse that talks about the rights of widows to lodging and maintenance. And that right is usually, those rights are for 1 whole year. But there's another verse that seems to talk about the same rights, this time for 4 months and 10 days. If you consider both verses to be talking about the same subject, then clearly you have a change in the ruling here from 1 year, and it was shortened to 4 months and 10 days. The verses for those who want to check, is Al-Baqarah, or chapter 2, verses 240, and chapter 2, Al-Baqarah, also Baqarah, this is 234. These are the two verses, if you want. Again, in my view, there's absolutely no connection between the two. They complement each other. It's not a case of contradiction. When it comes to by the Sunnah, Qur'an by the Sunnah, there's only really one case, and it is not a confirmed case. So we know in the Qur'an, there is the verse of the will, where Muslims are, anybody who's about to die is instructed to write a will in which, they say, well, who should get what of whatever they left behind. But then there's another verse in which gives kind of details about who should get what. That's the one that says, the verse where the male would have double the portion of the female, etc. That is a very detailed verse, Ayat al-Mirath, the inheritance verse. So there's also another hadith that says, لا وصية لوارث. I think لا وصية لوارث. So you should not leave a will for somebody who is going to inherit anyway. Who is going to inherit. Now, there's a couple of issues here. First of all, if you consider the instruction to leave a will to have been followed by another ayah in which states who should get what amount, then at best you must say this is a case of abrogation of the Qur'an by the Qur'an. In this case, the Prophet ﷺ is only kind of confirming, stressing what the Qur'an is saying. So if somebody has been given an amount in the verse of inheritance, then you don't make a will for that person. And in this case, the hadith is only clarifying. I'm not aware of any other case in which the Sunnah is said to have abrogated the Quran. Also, this hadith, in the eyes of many, is ahad, not mutawatir, not successive. Now, this is a serious issue. Why? Because the Quran is successive, mutawatir. So it reached us through a variety of people, number of different people. Mutawatir usually is defined differently by different scholars, but it's no less than 4 different routes, if you like, and sources, independent sources. But the main thing about mutawatir is that the number of people and who these people are must be such that their all being wrong is impossible. That's basically the principle, which is why Ibn Hajar didn't actually say exactly in his book how many people would make a hadith mutawatir. It's more of quality, if you like, of the information we have. But anyway, the point here is that this is ahad, not mutawatir, and it's only the only case of abrogation of the Quran by Sunnah, if at all. Now, how do people usually kind of justify, or scholars say, oh, is this really possible? Well, this is the ayah they rely on. I've talked about the Prophet ﷺ, nor does he speak from his own desires. It is not but a revelation that's revealed. This is kind of, إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَى وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَى إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَى. So scholars who believe that the Quran can be abrogated by Sunnah point to this verse and say, well, yes, the Quran is the word of God, but then at the same time, this ayah tells us the Prophet ﷺ wouldn't abrogate something in the Quran unless he was also, unless he received some inspiration, some revelation to this effect, in which case the source is the one and the same, the medium is different. So the source this time directly, let's say, from Allah, the Quran came from Jibreel, the outcome is one and the same. This is the verse that is usually relied on. And the verse that is used by those who reject the concept that the Quran can be abrogated by the Quran can be abrogated by the Sunnah is, and when our verses are recited to them as a clear evidence, those who do not expect the meeting with us say, bring us a Quran other than this or change it. Say, it is not for me to change it of my own accord. I only follow what is revealed to me.
I noticed, by the way, you're quoting, I think, from the Abdul Halim translation.
Okay, yeah. So what you have here is a verse that clearly the Prophet seems to be neutral, if you like, in that saying, I'm a third party to the Quran. Yeah. It's effectively, I'm no more than a medium here through which this Quran reaches you. I can't change it. I can't change nothing. This is the polytheist, obviously, challenging him to change it for whatever reasons they want him to do that. And he's saying, I can't do it. Now, obviously, some scholars can still come back and say, yes, of course, that verse is completely true. But if he were to change it, that still wouldn't be from him. That would be from God. And then the point here is that this discussion is inconclusive and it can go on forever. And it has been. Yes. So, but as I said, some do not allow, and a minority do not allow the abrogation of the Quran by Sunnah. There is one point I would want to raise here. The Quran describes the role of the Prophet with respect to the Quran. So he's a messenger. A messenger carries a message. A messenger does not change a message. He talks about him, and I read here specifically from ayat, وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الذِّكْرَ لِتُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ. And we have sent down to you the dhikr. Dhikr means remembrance, one of the names of the Quran, to clarify, to explain to people. Now, this particular function of the Prophet ﷺ is mentioned twice. One is in verse 44 of the chapter of An-Nahl, which is 16, and the other in same chapter, and this is number 64, 44 and 64 of chapter 16. So in both cases, the verb used, لِتُبَيِّنَ لَهُمْ, to explain to them, to show them, to convey to them. There is at no point in there, in the Quran, we find a similar, a verb, a different verb, conveying a different function along the lines of abrogate. That's one point, one argument also made by people who do not accept the abrogation of the Sunnah, of the Quran by the Sunnah.
Yeah.
Is everything clear so far?
Very clear, thank you.
Modes of abrogation. There are three different modes of abrogation. The first one and the major one, this is called legal abrogation. I call it legal, but my translation, it's called نسخ الحكم دون التلاوة, the abrogation of a ruling but not its wording. A ruling but not its wording. This, which is why you see I've put a check there. So the ruling stays, but the text is abrogated. The second is called legal textual. That's again my translation. In Arabic, it says نسخ الحكم والتلاوة, abrogation of a ruling and its wording, or the text basically that conveyed that ruling. The third, and you'll see we'll have the full set of them now, textual. This is when we have the text or the wording abrogated, but not the ruling. That's the exact opposite of legal abrogation. Now, I'm not going to focus on legal abrogation. Like I said earlier, the other two are the two that I'm going to deal with, because they are the ones relevant to the issue of the preservation of the Quranic text. In terms of acceptance of abrogation, I mentioned earlier that the majority accepted it, but there has been exceptions to the case. One name that comes up in the literature, I'm talking about early literature, somebody called Abu Muslim al-Isfahani. He's a Mu'tazilite. Obviously, Mu'tazilis are more kind of rationalist, if you like. At times, they take more freedom in terms of dismissing hadith more than others. Yeah. Obviously, I don't subscribe to the school of thought that dismiss them altogether just because they disagree with some hadith. Nor I, like to support anybody who dismiss any particular school of thought completely. It's more healthier to talk about specific ideas. Mu'tazili, in this case, basically, this particular Mu'tazili thinker, scholar, rejected the concept of abrogation. And he has kind of came up with some explanations as to why. There are references in the early literature of abrogation to some unnamed people, probably also of similar thinking, kind of, whether Mu'tazili or not. They also kind of disagreed or rejected abrogation. So there are some complaints by early sources on this subject. I should say here that legal textual, the last two, the legal textual and textual abrogations, are less accepted than the legal abrogation. Anybody who accepts abrogation must have accepted legal abrogation. And as we will see, historically speaking, this is the first form of abrogation that appears in literature. So there was legal abrogation, and I'll come to this later, and there was no hint of the other two. These two appeared later. That's what the literature tells us. The legal textual abrogation was not accepted by Shafi'i. At the same time, but he accepted textual abrogation implicitly. Tabari did not mention anything about textual abrogation. So some differences between scholars, in particular with these two, but there's more or less agreement on legal abrogation. Now, with our interest here being these two, the number 2 and number 3, this takes us to two important related concepts, but they are not exactly the same: the Qur'an and the Mus'haf. Oh. So this is an image I found it useful to explain, to help with the kind of explanation. So the light here is a reference to the Qur'an, and then the physical book is the Mus'haf. So what are these two, and how do they relate to each other? So the Qur'an is the revelation that the Prophet ﷺ received. These are what he heard from Sayyidina Gabriel. The Mus'haf is the record of this revelation. It's where it's recorded. So revelation is non-physical, if you like. Record is physical. You can look at it as the source. That's the revelation, the Qur'an, whereas the Mus'haf is the document. So strictly speaking, when we say Qur'an today, what we really mean Mus'haf often. When we say Qur'an, we should be meaning the revelation itself. So we often, when we talk and say, oh, this is my Qur'an, what I mean, my Mus'haf, that's my kind of version of the Qur'an. The Quranic revelation, of course, by definition, chronological. So it was revealed over 22 years, and by definition, it was chronological. The structure of the surahs and verses in the Mus'haf is not chronological. No. It was to a specific order. most scholars believe that this is how the Prophet ﷺ wanted it to be. So it was his own order, but there are some differences in opinion. So there's one Qur'an, but there are different looking mushafs. And the reason, because a mushaf will have different, for instance, script used to write, even the number of pages, these would also be different. There are a variety of, so you can look at a number of different mushaf. I've got a few here. They are different, but obviously the underlying revelation is one and the same. Now, the reason we're talking about, if you look at all these descriptions, there isn't really much of a difference between them in substance, as in the revelation here is there. The difference is that the wording, the verses at times, not in chronological order, they aren't. And also obviously they're different looking because a mushaf has to be written down on certain material in a particular font, etc., all that particular script. But the two abrogations we spoke about earlier, textual and legal textual abrogation, introduce a significant and substantial difference between the two. They imply that the mushaf is not a complete record of the Qur'an. The mushaf, because when we spoke about the abrogation of the wording, not the ruling, the wording, every time you say a wording of the Qur'an, a text of the Qur'an was abrogated, whether its ruling remained operative or not, you're effectively saying that this does not exist in the mushaf because it has no other meaning. It can only have any meaning with the reference to where it was written down. Otherwise, it would have no meaning.
Yeah.
Now, most people know, but I'll say quickly, Qur'an is derived from qara'a, read, because it was read to the Prophet ﷺ. He read it as well. Mushaf, on the other hand, means any compiled sheets of pages, if you like. So, and it occurs in the Quran 8 times, including in the context talking about Suhuf Musa, sheets of Moses.
Can I just clarify for myself and others that the mushaf you refer to, for example, I've got this book here, I've already referred to it, the Qur'an, a new translation by Abdul Halim. That is not a mushaf, is it? Because it's not in the Arabic. It's not the Arabic Quran. It's called the Quran, but it's not a mushaf. This is a translation into another language. So this is not the mushaf you're speaking of. That is the original Arabic, and only the Arabic. It's not like half Arabic, half English. It's only the Arabic Quran itself is called the mushaf.
Yeah. In fact, historically speaking, Muslims always avoided even writing anything, if possible, on the margins of their mushaf. So the texts were considered sacred from day one. Right. And Muslims always made sure that it is distinct from, obviously, over time, like you're absolutely right, when we translate, we still refer interchangeably, you use these two words, and also refer even to translations as being Quran, etc. And most people probably understand what it means, but there are some technical differences that are important to highlight here.
Yeah, thank you.
So I mentioned earlier that abrogation introduces significant, substantial difference between the two. Now, the Quran is the message of the Prophet ﷺ and the material he used. He had nothing else. No other literature, no other teachings. It is the source. Even when we talk about the Sunnah also was sourced from the Quran. It's not something different. Ultimately, regardless of how he was inspired, it's based and obviously supports the Quran. In the Quran, there is no concept of incomplete Quran as such. The Quran talks about a Quran. There's one concept. You can't look and find inside the Quran for any other kind of part of the Quran, if you like. or some but not other. There's only one concept, and it is the concept, the message, the Qur'an, the book, the kitab, etc. That's very important, because the concept of a book being an incomplete and the only surviving record of the Qur'an is quite strange from this point of view. Okay, so where does this idea come from? The idea that some verses were abrogated, as in disappeared, or this is the main verse that is usually referred to, Al-Baqarah 2106, and whatever ayah we abrogate, the word, the Arabic word nansukh, or cause to be forgotten, we bring a better or the like of it. So the word, the critical word is ayah. Do you not know that Allah is powerful over all everything? Now, a couple of things to highlight here. This explanation, this interpretation presumes that ayah here means verse. If it doesn't mean verse, the case for abrogation based on this, in the sense we're talking about, becomes just basically loses its grounds. So if ayah here means something else, then that's the case. That's not then an abrogation of text. The word ayah in Arabic means sign, means a proof. A sub-meaning of that is a Quranic verse. Because if you think about it, everything around us is an ayah. Everything. The Quran itself is one ayah as a whole, or multiple ayahs, if you like. But it's still a subset of the whole universe and everything around us that is considered as ayah, which is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to the creation of the earth, heavens, every form of creation, everything around us, we see night and day, everything is an ayah. So this is a particular kind of meaning that is being presumed here, that it means a Quranic text. And forgotten is interesting here, because there are two ways apparently for this ayah to disappear or to be abrogated, either to abrogate, nansukh, or to be forgotten. Now, what's interesting here is that there seems to be a distinction between two different things then. There's abrogation, naskh, and apparently there's something else called forgotten. And then, if we were then to use this verse as the basis of the concept of abrogation, then we surely have to talk about two different things apparently. One is called abrogation, and the other one is forgetting verses effectively, which is different. And the other question is, why would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala abrogate or cause to be forgotten something, an ayah, a verse, just to bring a better or the like of it? And what does better mean? We don't have this concept of one ayah is better than others, and then we list them starting with the best and then go downward. There's no such a concept. And the other thing is, if the replacement is of one verse with another, what does mean the like of it? What does that mean? So that sounds a particularly random thing to do, which of course Allah wouldn't have done. So that's kind of some of the objections here. The other one, I mentioned that the main form of abrogation is legal abrogation. So abrogation of rulings. Now, the word ayah is not really used in the Quran to mean a ruling. It doesn't. It's not used in that sense. There are other words like hukum, so hukum, ruling, ahkam, rulings. But ayah itself is not used in this particular sense as a ruling. Ayah is more like proof, indication that something pointing to Allah. Now, this is another verse that, if you look at the word ayah in this particular verse, and I wanted to link these two, because you're but a man like ourselves, so bring an ayah if you are one of the truthful. Now, this is surely isn't a challenge to bring an ayah as in a verse. This is a challenge to bring a miracle, something paranormal, something so impressive that they will say, yes, that surely has come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is just kind of one verse. I wanted to put it next to it. And why is that? Because one principle a lot of scholars follow when studying the Qur'an, interpreting it, which I personally adopt, is called Al-Qur'an yufassiru ba'dahu ba'da. Al-Qur'an yufassiru ba'dahu ba'da. The Qur'an interprets itself. So if you want to make sure you understand a particular expression or particular issue, you ought to look at everything, all references, related references in the Qur'an, to ensure that you have a holistic view and you're closer to understanding what the text might be talking about.
Just to say that, Abdul, this translation which we're quoting, well, which I quote from as well, Abdul Halim, one of perhaps many scholars say it's the gold standard in English translations of the Quran. In this particular verse you've cited, he translates, show us a sign if you are telling the truth. So right. exactly what you're saying. Ayah there means a sign, like a miracle, rather than a verse of the Quran itself. So that translation would confirm your interpretation as well.
Absolutely, Paul. Thank you. I didn't know about the translation, their translation, that they've gone with this particular, but that's kind of the standard. And this is what the text seems to say, naturally, what the text seems to suggest. I think one issue we have when we study the Quran, and when at times it's how to kind of leave all the baggage aside and try and kind of just approach it as neutrally as possible. And this is difficult. This is hard. Hard for me, hard for you, hard for everybody. But it's one thing that we need always to try and do. Often, any interpretation that looks to be really manufactured comes from effectively relying more on the baggage than effectively the text in its pure form, without kind of projecting on it something we already believe in. There's another ayah or another concept, it's called the replacement of ayahs. So that's also been cited as evidence to support the case for abrogation. And this is the verse in question. When we replace an ayah with another ayah, and Allah knows better what He sends down, they say you are only a forger. No, rather most of them have no knowledge. Now, for instance, Tabari links this ayah to the earlier ayah we spoke about, which he also talks about in the context of abrogation. This is quite a standard ayah to quote and seek for support. Now, one thing interesting about this ayah, this is from Surah An-Nahl. It's a Meccan ayah. Now, one interesting thing about it is that there was no abrogation in Mecca. All the cases of abrogation that scholars talk about are all Medinite. Mm-hmm. Now, why would there be such a verse in Mecca if it's actually what it's talking about is ayah as in verse? Almost all agree that the first case of abrogation was the change of qibla, which happened obviously in year 2 after the migration of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In these verses, the alternative interpretation that's adopted by some scholars is that what the ayah, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here is talking about, ayah in the sense of sign. A sign could be a miracle, could be, and also it's not talking always at the time of the Prophet. So here, for instance, Muhammad Abdu, for instance, the reformist, the Egyptian reformist from the 19th century and early 20th century, also took it to mean effectively the replacement of older signs with the new ones. So the Prophet ﷺ, in his time, was like a new proof, a new evidence on Allah, on the message of the oneness of Allah, etc. All these concepts he represented, and he was evidence, new evidence of. And in that context, in that way, a lot of scholars think that ayah should be understood in this way. And I would do what I did earlier with the previous slide, and I would quote a similar verse here, and look at that. Ask the children of Israel how many a clear ayah we have given them, and whoever replaces the favor of Allah after it has come to him, then indeed Allah is severe in punishment and penalty. Now, what's interesting is that both verses use exactly the same wording, ayah for ayah, and the verb baddal or yubaddil, replace. So both of them. Now, if you read the second ayah, surely you aren't gonna say here Allah is talking about the verse. It isn't.
No, indeed.
On the other hand, you may argue and say verses are not replaceable. Again, this is some text to this effect. Recite what has been revealed to you of the book of your Lord. There is no changer of his words. Now, changer here is the same verb, la mubaddil. Mubaddil as in change or replace the words of God. And another verse which kind of give the same meaning is saying. What's interesting here is that every time, there are 4 times where the words, the qawl, the word, if you like, is the subject of change. So when the meaning is intended to be about text, there is actually in the verse what refers explicitly to that. So we have four cases where the subject is the word or words, twice saying, and twice the Qur'an itself as a text. So these are 8 references in which Allah obviously is talking rhetorically here, that there is nobody can change the word, and the word is used, not ayah, is talking about words. Now, this is where we're going to get into kind of details of abrogation of text. So, if abrogation happened, scholars thought of we needed a mechanism for that. How did text that was revealed at some point, because that's what the Qur'an is, ultimately text, even though it's read, how did it go away? And that is the verse that is usually used. We shall make you read nuqri'uka means make you read Qur'an here. It doesn't mean just read Qur'an, so that you do not forget, except what Allah wills. He knows what is manifest and what is hidden. Now, the way I read it here is a confirmation that he, as in the Prophet ﷺ, won't forget. Not that he will forget, he won't forget. Now, but they say, except what Allah wills. So what is that? Well, that's a general expression that is used elsewhere in the Quran, and it does not mean that there will be exceptions there. And if you look at this, And do not say of anything, I will do it tomorrow, except if Allah wills. And remember your Lord when you forget. Now, look at the context of forget there. Clearly, the context of forget here isn't forgetting a particular verse. This is about the Prophet ﷺ being told that you don't rely completely on Allah. He wanted his mindset to be completely and utterly owned by Allah. So every time he says, even saying, I want to do something, whether he says it explicitly or it has to be there at least implicitly, he's thinking that I am an instrument in the hands of Allah. That's the purpose of this ayah. It doesn't mean that he was, every time the Prophet, every time said anything, 100%, every time he said, inshallah, inshallah. That's not the point. The point is that that's the mindset that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made him live in. If at times there was any element of forgetfulness, then this is a reminder that he should not. So remember your Lord when you forget. Remember, because it's an element of forgetfulness in the case of the Prophet ﷺ, to forget that it won't happen. It cannot happen without Allah's support. What is demanded of him probably was much even more than what's demanded of any one of us. So that's kind of the highest standards set in this particular ayah. But as you can see, the concept of forgetting isn't actually anything to do with forgetting verses. And this is another one. This is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this comes after, and if Satan should cause you to forget, then do not remain after the reminder with the wrongdoing people. This comes after he's told them, don't sit with those who speak offensively about us, about the revelation. And obviously at times he would probably take some people for kind of as like seriously trying to discuss the Qur'an, etc. And this is a reminder to him that some of these people are only trying to offend you, trying to offend our message. They are not serious. So once you realize, he was very keen on converting as many people, talking to as many people as possible. He's being reminded here. Now, the forgetting here, as you can see, is also forgetting that has nothing to do with forgetting the Quran. And it just shows that the concept of forgetting there can also equally be understood as something to do with forgetting an element of behavior, of certain behaviors. In fact, Qurtubi, the exegete, famous exegete, quotes a well-known Sufi sheikh called Junaid Baghdadi. And according to Junaid Baghdadi, he was a 3rd century scholar. He thinks that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the first verse talking about applying something, anything in the Quran. So any element of forgetting any instruction is being referred to here, nothing else. Of course, except what wills, probably people know there are verses in the Quran where this very expression is used about things that we know will happen. So for instance, there is talks Allah about those who go to paradise and those who go to hell being there forever. إِلَّا مَا شَاءَ اللَّهُ, except what Allah wills. Now, that verse and that expression does not negate the many other verses that confirm the eternal nature of what happens there. This is again a reminder, as if he's saying, even though I've said that, I've confirmed that, I'm reminding you, this is my will. That's what I wanted. Inna Allah fa'alun lima yurid. Allah does what he wants. That's really the context of that, nothing to do with being making the Prophet forget certain things. Right. So now that some scholars, a lot of scholars accepting forgetting as a mechanism for abrogation, we look at the literature and we see it's full of references to various stories of forgetting. And I've called them natural and supernatural because of the nature of them, basically. And this is one example. Now, this is a story that the Prophet ﷺ once was praying, and it looks like he might have forgotten something. That's the account that we have, which comes from Bukhari, by the way. And then he forgotten something, or an ayah or so. So after he finished, somebody asked him and said, did something happen during the prayer? So I presume asking him, was there like something unusual? And he told them no. And he explained that I'm a human being like you, so I'm liable to forget like you. If I forget, remind me. Now, why I'm citing this particular story? Simply because it shows, it talks about an element of kind of a human forgetting, basically. It's not a divine tool as abrogation presents forgetting. It just, the prophets say, at times I forget. Now, this is, like I say, mentioned in Bukhari. Another story. Now, this is quite some, again, this comes from Bukhari. The Prophet ﷺ is said to have one night heard somebody, and he said, he read in the Qur'an, and he said, he has reminded me of so-and-so verses that I had been made to forget from chapter so-and-so. This hadith has every element of forgery. And let me tell you why. No historian would report anything in which, or accept anything in which all the information that is of significance is missing. We don't know who that man is. We don't know what verses we're talking about. And we have no idea even the chapters they belong to. The event is completely casual. So the Prophet ﷺ heard someone, where, how, we have no idea. Whoever reported this hadith or the story is clearly not very much interested in giving us what the details are. It's just so casual. Now, at the same time, it's kind of, the forgetting has become completely aimless. So he was made to forget, but then he heard this man and he remembered. So what is the point exactly? If that wasn't a kind of a human forgetting, an instance of failure of memory, let's say, if it was true, let's accept that, then obviously that's understandable. But we can't say this is a divine instrument that made the Prophet forget, which is what forgetting is, according to the doctrine of abrogation. Yet he was reminded in a casual way by somebody who we don't know, and the whole forgetting has just became nothing, basically, because he's remembered everything. What's interesting is that this particular hadith, Bukhari has another, not Bukhari, actually, other scholars, not Bukhari, have a version of it in which it says that I had forgotten, not I had been made to forget. So that seems to be kind of trying to reconcile, well, what's the point if he was made to forget, suggesting it was divine or Allah, and then he was reminded? Makes no sense. So this other version sounds more kind of reasonable, if you like. It says he forgot and then he remembered. And this is another saying. This one comes from Ahmad bin Hanbal. Now, admittedly, Ahmad bin Hanbal collected a huge number of hadith. And a lot of people know that a lot of them are weak, incorrect, so people don't accept everything there. But the point here isn't that really. The point is that this is the material of abrogation. So there wasn't much. Stop there. Let's look at the hadith. Oh, this is weak. This is ahad. This is not mutawatir. Not really. A lot of the time, not to say all the time, everything was accepted, but the material, this is very common material in the literature of abrogation. Now here we've got Ubay asking the Prophet. The Prophet prayed Fajr, the dawn prayer, left out a particular verse. So Ubay, after the prayer, asked him, was verse so-and-so abrogated, or did you forget it? And the Prophet replies, I was made to forget it. Again, the problem you see here is the distinguishing abrogation from forgetting. But then the whole point of forgetting is, well, it was like the kind of divine instrument, or the way abrogation took place, if you like. So it becomes kind of quite aimless there. At the same time, we need to remember there are a lot of hadiths in which the Prophet ﷺ talks about the importance of memorizing, learning the Qur'an. So these kind of hadith, come across as quite shocking and very difficult to reconcile. So I'm going to quote one hadith here that goes, the sins of my ummah, my nation, were paraded in front of me, and I did not see a graver sin than that of a man who forgets a chapter or verse after it was made known to him. That comes from Tirmidhi. Now, that's completely impossible to reconcile with what we see here. And let's just think about it slightly differently. If this is the state of the Prophet ﷺ, if he forgot his own revelation, the revelation that he received from Allah, about which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told him, فَلَا تَنْسَ, so that you do not forget. If that what happened to him, well, what are the chances that the Qur'an, the revelation, has actually survived? If a verse can be forgotten, well, then we have to talk about a lot more instances of verses being distorted. That's natural, because forgetting is more of an extreme case of a failure of memory or whatever it is. Then if he forgot verses, well, how many verses then were kind of had their wordings changed, etc. It just opens up a lot of possibilities, really, and I find it difficult to defend those. And if that wasn't good enough, we have what I call large-scale forgetting. Now, we're getting into real stuff now, Paul. So, the story here is that Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, who was made wali, governor of Basra, called 300 readers of the Qur'an, and he was preaching to them. He tells them, before you, this is a companion, by the way. We used to read a chapter that we used to liken in length and strength to Bara'ah, or called Tawbah, which I was made to forget, but I have memorized of it. He mentioned just single piece of text. We also used to read a chapter we likened to one of the musabbihat. Musabbihat, this is a group of chapters that start with variations of the word sabbaha, glorify, which I had been made to forget, but I remember this of it. And again, he cites a little reference. This hadith, now just to give you an idea what that means, Bara'ah is 129 verses. 129. So Abu Musa al-Ash'ari has forgotten a whole chapter that was this long. Now, what's also strange about what he's saying here is the personal tone of what he's talking about. So he's called these 300 readers of the Quran, and he's supposedly to be a higher authority, talking to them, advising them how to be careful of the Quran. But then if that's a personal experience, well, where is that chapter? Couldn't we find it? Where is it? It must be somewhere. and he could have easily, presumably, asked someone about it. It looks like a completely different journal of hadith here. This is talking about personal experience, and it makes no sense really. And this hadith comes from Muslim, no less. So this isn't from some unknown source. A different story from Ahmad bin Hanbal. This is Ubay, the Sahabi, asking a Tabi'i, successor, how long, Zir bin Hubaysh, how long is the chapter of Ahzab that you read? This is chapter number 33. And he says 70 odd verses. Ubay replies, I read it with the Prophet and it was like Al-Baqarah or even longer. It contained the stoning verse. Now, the Al-Ahzab currently 73 verses. If it was as long as Al-Baqarah, then we have 213 verses missing. And according to Ubay, he also identified one of those verses, and it is the so-called stoning verse, Ayatul Rajm. Ayatul Rajm. There is another hadith, actually I have it here, not there, in my notes, from Hudhayfa, and this is found in a book of hadith called Musannaf Abi Shiba, which is in the 3rd century, early 3rd century. I think is earlier than Bukhari as well. And he's talking about the chapter of Bara'ah or Tawbah. And he's telling somebody, you don't treat today more than a quarter of what was, a quarter. Now, if we know Bara'ah is 129 verses, then this hadith suggests 387 verses of that chapter have gone missing somehow. There are actually also narratives about whole chapters not being there. So Musannaf ibn Hanbal, ibn Shiba talks about 2 verses called Al-Hafd wal-Khala. They mentioned in other sources. So that's large-scale forgetting. I have done a partial count of inexistent verses. So verses that are said to have been in the Qur'an, revealed in the Qur'an, but they did not survive. And I used only 3 hadith. And out of these, I came up with this.
Interesting.
The blue is the number of verses we have in the Mus'haf today. This is the number of missing verses just from these 3 hadith. And if somebody is more interested in math, then that's about 10.5% of the revelation. And that's only 3 hadiths. One of them is from Muslim, which is obviously highly regarded. I consider this situation preposterous. I don't, and I cannot accept it. If somebody thinks that this represents a rejection of hadith, well, it isn't. That represents a rejection of a particular journal of hadith that cannot be actual, that cannot be real, that cannot be authentic. The Qur'an was the message itself. Qur'an is Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and Muhammad is the Qur'an. I can't accept, no one should accept that the Qur'an can have this done to it, not given what we're going to get to later, because this is not just, there are other things we're going to discuss which make clear that this just cannot be the case. If this was if we were given this kind of pie chart about Christian sources, we would have torn them apart.
Hmm.
We would have had a really heyday. We would have enjoyed ourselves. But that comes from that. Now, something I should have mentioned earlier. When we talk about the preservation of the Qur'an and the accusations that the Mus'haf is incomplete or some verses disappeared somehow, often we remember Orientalists, Western scholars, non-Muslim scholars. None of this discussion, we will not mention anybody who's not a Muslim. This is all within Islamic literature. So this isn't really somebody who's done this to us. And it is what we find in our own literature. Moving on. Problems in legal textual abrogation. This is when both the text and the ruling disappear, like the examples we've just seen, because we don't know even the ayat, what these were. We have no idea what these were. Now, hundreds of clearly non-legal verses. Now, if abrogation is talking about supposedly texts that have some legal sense, then clearly we're talking about hundreds of non-legal verses. Also, we seem to have forgotten and unforgotten texts. So some texts that survived, and some that did not. What we have here really is a doctrine, and I'm talking about abrogation, that has been developed to cater for random narratives, pull them together and create a theme of them. There's a theme, there's a concept, and that is considered as a divine instrument. So abrogation is presented as divine instrument. Why? These scholars didn't do this out of any bad intention, of course not. Their main intention is to defend the Qur'an and the Mus'haf, both of them. So they want to say the Quranic revelation was not lost. Anything that did not survive in the Mus'haf, it did so because Allah wanted it to be so. So the Mus'haf effectively is the revelation of the Qur'an that Allah wanted to stay to the very end, if you like, to stay forever. The Qur'an, however, is a bigger corpus of revelation that includes verses that, again, Allah removed for reasons He knows. Now, when you have this kind of doctrine, like abrogation in this sense, yes, it is trying to explain certain narratives, but I wouldn't be surprised personally if it ended up sourcing some of them, because it's very suggestive. Anything that potentially can develop into a story can develop into a story. Now, I've got the doctrine there that can justify why it has these verses, etc., were removed. There's one particular example I would want to mention of here. There's a passage, they call it, it goes something like that. I'll read it here in one of its versions. This is supposed to have been abrogated. If the son of Adam possessed 2 valleys of gold, he would want another. Nothing fills the soul of the son of Adam but dust. Allah forgives whom He likes. This is supposedly, according to Ibn Abbas, was a verse. Now, what's interesting about that is that, first of all, it's not legal, so there's no legal ruling there. It's not clear why, if this was a verse, why it would be removed. It looks like just a saying. It looks completely common sense, very much, in line with what the Quran teaches us about the human nature. But for some reason, it's not there. It's mentioned in Ahmad, this particular verse, in more than 20 versions. Bukhari has it 5 times. Once in a hadith that doubts it's a verse, in 3 hadith just mention it as hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, a 5th as as a verse that was abrogated by another verse, Al-Hakum al-Takathur, about, multiplying, has kept you busy, having lots of children. In Muslim, it's mentioned because it's in the hadith I cited earlier about Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, when he said, I forgot this whole chapter, which was as long as Bara'ah. Apart from, this is actually the text that I removed from there. That's a particular text, again, mentioned in Muslim, at times as verse, as in there, at times as hadith as well. So obviously what Bukhari Muslim are trying to do here, just collect narratives that they heard, not necessarily saying that is not, correct, or that, and they seem to contradict each other, just they listed them. But then if that's the case, then clearly some critical work needs to be done in terms of making sense of these narratives there, because they cannot be reconciled, all of them. Now we move to the textual abrogation. This is when we have cases of verses that had their text removed, but the wording removed, but the text, the ruling remained there. There are actually only 3 cases. One of them isn't even worth talking about because it's about one extra word. They say in the current Mus'haf, that it's not in the current Mus'haf, but it's not actually, it's just a case of interpretation. It's nothing to do. It's about fasting, where it says 3 days, ثلاث أيام متتابعات, as in successive. The word successive in some narrative is said to be a part of the verse. So that's one case I'm not going to discuss. But this is interesting because this particular hadith comes from Muslim, Nasa'i, and others. This is attributed to Sayyidah Aisha. In what was sent down of the Qur'an, there used to be 10 attested sucklings that set the ban of marriage. What's talking about here is that the number of times a small child would be suckled by somebody such that he wouldn't be legally, he cannot get married to that woman or a daughter of that woman or somebody else she suckled. So the hadith is saying there used to be, I'm going to read it, in what was sent down of the Quran, there used to be 10 attested sucklings. So there's a verse that said 10 times, 10 sucklings would then ban this particular child from getting married to the woman who suckled him or any other daughter of that woman or any girl she suckled. But then the hadith goes, then they were abrogated by 5 attested ones. So the verse of 10 was replaced by another, that's 5. And then it goes on, the Prophet died and so the 5 sucklings verse were still being read as part of the Quran. Now, obviously, the first thing you notice there, apart from the case of double abrogation, is the fact that this is a case of abrogation apparently after the Quran, somehow, after the Prophet ﷺ. So abrogation is supposed to have happened all during his life. Well, what we're talking about here, surely we can't treat it as abrogation even in the sense it's defined. This seems to have just gone missing somehow. The ruling, however, survived apparently for some scholars, not all of them. Some people have tried to explain this away. Zarkashi, for instance, tried to say that this abrogation happened shortly before the death of the Prophet. So some Muslims didn't know about the abrogation, and that's what Aisha is talking about. Well, that's not really what the hadith says. The hadith is pretty clear that they were being still this verse was still part of the Qur'an when the Prophet died. Now, there is another version of this hadith in Muslim. What's interesting here, it does not have the ending. The Prophet died and the 5 sucklings were still being read as part of it's the same hadith, but doesn't have this controversial ending. Now, Paul, you do a lot of New Testament criticism and stuff. Imagine if this was found in the New Testament. So you have like a verse occurs one place without the Son of God and another with the Son of God. We would immediately say, here we go, manipulation, something went terribly wrong, etc. And we would probably cast doubt on the whole text anyway, let alone any part of it.
That actually happens in the first verse in Mark's Gospel, where the Son of God is there in some translations, but it's not there in earlier versions, and so it's seen as a later addition. That very example of the Son of God in Mark is seen as a later interpolation.
Absolutely. And obviously, what's interesting here is that Malik and Abu Hanifa, in their legal system, they accept one suckling as banning marriage. So clearly they haven't gone even with the 5 suckling in this hadith. So in terms of legal system, the hadith is there, it's in Muslim, it's accepted when people talk about abrogation, yet the jurists, for some reason, actually didn't take much notice in it. Shafi'i did, but Malik said, acknowledged, what's interesting in the case of Malik, he acknowledged the hadith, but he said, this is not what the practice is, because he was very much focused on the practice of, they called Ahl al-Medina, the people of Medina. So he's effectively saying this is not what used to be the standard practice in Medina. So he didn't go with this ruling in the hadith. So this is one of the 2 cases. The second is the stoning verse. This creates a lot
famous controversial one,
yeah. Well, as if the earlier ones weren't, but this is even more so.
Even more so.
Here's the version, the text of it, as it occurs in Malik, Ahmad, Nasa'i, Ibn Majah, other books of hadith. If a sheikh and sheikha commit adultery, then stone them. Absolutely. As a punishment from Allah, and Allah is mighty wise. This is attributed to Umar bin Khattab, and usually where it came from most of the sources. One thing to notice about there is the word sheikh and sheikha. They are taken to mean married man and married woman, because in the Qur'an, the punishment for unmarried, or doesn't say married or unmarried, is whipping, flogging. Here, because we have this particular verse or passage, jurists and scholars, they've concluded this is talking about married people. If married people, then this will happen to them. Now, what's interesting is that the word sheikh and sheikha in the Quran, why is it important to look at the meaning of how these words are used in the Quran? Because that's the Arabic of the time, how it was used. Right. Sheikh means an old man.
Yeah.
An old man. Sheikha doesn't exist because the word for that is ajuz. It's a different word altogether. So how sheikha was made the feminine of sheikh in this context, and both were taken to mean a married man and woman, I have no idea. But that's basically what it's taken to mean. Now, this comes from Muslim, Bukhari, Abu Dawood. This is Umar talking from the pulpit. Allah sent Muhammad in truth, and he sent down on him the book. among what Allah sent down is the stoning verse. We read it, understood it, and memorized it. The Messenger of Allah stoned, and we stoned after him. I fear that after some time, someone might say, we do not find the verse of stoning in the book of Allah, so they go astray by abandoning a commandment that Allah revealed. So, what's kind of, a lot of things are intriguing about this. First of all, Umar here is talking to Muslims in Medina and telling them that apparently they didn't know the Prophet stoned, or they did not believe he stoned some people. They don't seem to be aware of something called textual abrogation, or they did not believe in it, because he's telling them, if it's not there, don't worry, it's okay. The legal is still valid. And then what's also here, it's kind of interesting. The word book of Allah, this is quite strange, because book of Allah is the Qur'an. Now, what we seem to be kind of confusion here, because the book of Allah is the Qur'an, and we use that to refer to the whole revelation. But obviously, he's using it here to refer to the Mus'haf specifically, but then the verse is not in the Mus'haf. So is the Mus'haf the book of Allah? Well, if the Mus'haf is the book of Allah, what is the Qur'an then? Because the Qur'an is actually bigger than the Mus'haf, supposedly, according to this hadith. So the other thing to kind of highlight here is the kind of, again, what I mentioned earlier, if you put yourself in that place and try to imagine what people were thinking, what Umar was trying to tell them, if that was what he was saying here, what was the status of everything else then? That's actually the kind of lecture Muslims, he wasn't lecturing to anybody. Surely Sahaba were sitting there, Huffaz, memorizers of the Qur'an were sitting there, scholars, those people who lived with the Prophet from day one, some of them, and throughout. So he was actually giving a sermon to these people, telling them that kind of thing. If that was the status of Muslims, do we really accept that? If we do, we have to revise our understanding of the Muslim community and the first generation of Muslims, and basically everything that we receive from that generation. If that is the case, it's a serious thing. Now, where does this come from, all this kind of emphasis on the stoning verse? And I didn't get into that in my slides, but I'll talk about it briefly. Because there are hadiths about the Prophet ﷺ stoning certain people, individuals who committed adultery. What's interesting about those hadith is when you kind of look at even about how he behaved, even the Prophet ﷺ, the behavior is quite strange. So for instance, somebody would come kind of almost try to convince him that he has to stone her. Now, who would do that? I mean, who would do that? What? How? I mean, somebody committed, a sin. You would think that she would go away, seek somehow to repair what happened, ask for forgiveness, etc. But then just to come and then force the Prophet ﷺ to order her to be stoned, and then as if without stoning, that sin cannot be forgiven. Well, we know that the only thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not forgive is shirk, ishrak. That's according to the Qur'an. Why would somebody need to die in order for that to happen? Let me give you another point. Like I said, I didn't get about this into the in those slides, but I think I might as well talk about it a little. Okay. There is no sin that is related to belief in the Qur'an that would kind of entail or necessitate murder or being killed. There's nothing. There's no such a thing. This is somebody who made a mistake, and that's that. And then the people did all kinds of things. People killed, people robbed, people, etc. Nobody came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, well, kill me because I did that. And it is just not human nature, not human behavior. So the whole kind of narrative, very much suggestive of fiction, basically. And those hadith, as you can see, even the second one in particular, seems to take the practice at its starting point, not the verse, not the alleged verse, but the alleged verse is being brought there for support because the starting point is the practice. So as if we're stressing there used to be a verse in order to kind of further justify the stoning there. Now, this is a listing of the earliest sources that mention naskh, abrogation. These are the earliest, when I wrote my book, the earliest I could find. So as you can see, the earliest of these accept only legal, all of them accept legal. The earliest do not accept legal textual or textual. I mean by that, they don't mention it. So they seem to have not been aware of it. And my conclusion is that these as concepts of abrogation developed later. This developed first, legal textual, and textual developed afterwards. And you can see the differences even between, say, Shafi'i, who only implicitly accepted textual abrogation. In fact, the earliest that mentioned them all is in Muhasibi, and that's well into the 3rd century. Basically, by the beginning of the 4th century, the three forms of abrogation were well established. They become part of what would develop into Quranic studies or ulum al-Qur'an, sciences of the Qur'an. So a lot of these books would always have a chapter on naskh, on abrogation. Now, where I'm going with this, what I'm trying to suggest here is that abrogation is no explanation. We have two possible conclusions. Either we accept that the Mus'haf is an incomplete record of the Qur'an, or we have to accept that those hadith, that particular genre of hadith, just in case some people think and award me the title Qur'anist, I'm not actually a Qur'anist. I don't believe the Qur'an covers everything, and we need the Sunnah to learn about our religion. But I'm talking about a particular genre of hadith. There is a challenge for those who reject those hadith, and there's a challenge for those who accept those hadith. It's a personal choice. Each one of them has implications. What I tried to show here is that accepting those hadiths would result in the Mus'haf being an incomplete record of the Quran. And is this acceptable? Now, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about deliberate or unwittingly. So whether the Mus'haf is incomplete because it was a process, a divine instrument, that's what it is. If those hadith were inauthentic because they're deliberately kind of fabricated or unwittingly developed into that, that's what it is. In both cases, and these are not, just to clarify, mutually exclusive. Somebody, and I would think maybe someone non-Muslim might take both of them and say, yeah, there are inauthentic hadiths, but I still think the Mus'haf is incomplete. Some might still take that. Now, against all of this, we have this ayah. It is He who sent down the dhikr, remembrance, and it is we preserving it. This is the preservation of revelation. Often people refer to this ayah in this context, but there's actually another ayah that is equally relevant. And this, which is this, it is an impregnable book. Falsehood cannot approach it from before it or from behind it. It's a revelation from wise, praiseworthy. And that is protection of revelation against change. These two ayahs, verses, along other arguments we talked about earlier, but I would like to keep this in mind and measure the hadiths that we've gone through against these two. What is it preserving here? Preserving what? How? And this expression, falsehood cannot approach it from before it or from behind it, meaning even afterwards. Nothing can change this fact. And what's interesting in both verses, they actually refer to the Qur'an as dhikr. In the second verse, it's actually the verse before this verse, it's talking about Qur'an dhikr. Dhikr means remembrance. It's the opposite of forget. It is the opposite of forget. Yet we have those hadiths talking about how the verses were forgotten. Yet one of the names of the Qur'an is dhikr. Dhikr. It's dhikr because we remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's because that's the whole atmosphere of it. One of dhikr, of remembering.
There's another kind of corroboration of what you're saying, I think, is that not only today do we have one Quran with the exact number of surahs and the contents are the same for all Muslims everywhere, but going back to the first century of the Muslim era, even the mushabs, the manuscripts we have, we don't find extra bits of Quran which no one identifies as revelation today floating around. We don't have these kind of extraneous bits of revelation that we might expect, perhaps, if some of these views are true. So we have a very tight, clearly defined set of surahs that we, right from the beginning, that we have today. And we have the manuscripts now. We have them going right back to at least the time of Uthman himself. And as I keep on saying, we don't have these extra missing surahs that are not in today's Quran, for example. So that would kind of corroborate, I think, what you're saying.
I completely agree with you, Paul. And to add further, what's interesting, if you open a book like Meta Tafsir, Meta Exegesis, like Tabari's, if you pick a random verse, you're likely to end up with multiple interpretations of that verse, at times of a word in that. So you can see the amount of mental effort that was exerted in trying to understand the text, yet it's the one and the same text. All this effort, intellectual effort, did not result in a different text. Another point, again, along the lines you mentioned, we Muslims have two main schools of thought, Sunnis and Shias, and there are others. Despite the differences between them, everybody reads the same Mus'haf. It's the same Qur'an.
Yeah.
Now, Umar could not have been able to, even if he wanted to burn other Mus'hafs, just humanly is not possible to stop them. There were different people elsewhere who thought differently. People we know from history hid for centuries, that came out later, books. They did that. And they came out and they would discover there are different versions of different books. Never with the Quran. It's always the same.
Exactly.
And just to finish off with one slide, which is exactly what you spoke about. And now this is about personal observation here. It's the Birmingham Mus'haf. Now, for those who, that's...
We actually had the privilege of interviewing Professor Thomas, who is the lead academic on this, on blogging theology, and he's not a Muslim at all. But he testified, as I'm sure you're about to explain, that this very, very early, if not the earliest Quran, is identical to the modern Quran.
Okay, so So these are, as you know, Paul, the earliest we have. These 2 folios, 4 pages, found in the Mingani collection at the University of Birmingham. I saw it there, as many people obviously went there to see them. In Hijazi script, they have skeletal dots, i'jan, but not tashkil, not the small vowels there. They have, and what's interesting, by the way, tashkil came kind of entered the Quran by, they say, Abu Aswad Du'li. Abu Aswad Du'li died about 69 Hijri, and these don't have tashkil. They're very early. According to carbon dating, this could be as early as from the first decade or 2 after the Prophet ﷺ, potentially even from his time. We don't know. They are from 2 chapters from Al-Kahf, chapter 18, and Maryam 19. I actually compared them word for word. They're exactly what you have and what we have in the Mus'haf today. But what was interesting, and what that red mark is about. So when I was reading them there, I tried to read. It's not easy because there is different script, but you can make out most of it. And I noticed as I was there standing, just looking at the folio reading, and I noticed in the second page that thing that is highlighted or kind of circled in red. And that's from one of the verses I mentioned earlier. Here it says, لا مبدل لكلماته, no changer for his words. That is in the oldest manuscript of the Qur'an, that particular expression, which I found very poignant and very touching. So I just wanted to highlight it and to say that the Qur'an is very difficult for a Muslim, and I think for a historian, to accept that the Qur'an, the Mus'haf that we have today, is other than anything other than the complete revelation of the Qur'an. And thank you.
Right. Well, that's fantastic. Well, thank you very much indeed for that thorough, clear, and comprehensive exposition of the subject of abrogation in the Quran. Very, very interesting indeed. So thank you very much for that, sir. I would just conclude now by mentioning that you, inshallah, will come back on the 27th of June, discuss a completely different subject, the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, as we read in the Bible, of course. And you're going to be comparing the accounts in the Quran and the Bible, checking them for historicity, accuracy, perhaps, and highlighting the differences as well. So that promises to be a fascinating tour of that subject as well. The exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, of course, a very famous story in the Bible, in Exodus, obviously, in the Bible. So thank you for that. Look forward to that. And yeah, thank you very much again, Dr. Louay Fatoohi, for your time, your expertise, your scholarly thoroughness and clarity. They don't always go together, those with scholar. You don't always get, sometimes you get the thoroughness without the clarity, but you have them both combined in your presentation today. So I do appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for having me back. Thank you, Paul.
Until next time.
Thank you.